And another quick reminder of ourselves and the team. I'm joined tonight with Iona. Stephen unfortunately couldn't make it tonight. And we also have Fiona Shaw from the Improving Gender Balance team, who's going to be delivering the first part of tonight's session. But I'll introduce you to her just in a few minutes. So on the screen, you'll just see the reminder of the regional support teams. If you haven't already joined, then the codes are there for you. And they're towards the end of the session, we'll share with you again the dates for the next drop-in sessions later next term. And Iona's already posted this into the chat, but just a reminder about the Padlet. That's the place for your questions and your comments. It's the same as the one that we've been using all the way through. So we're beginning to get quite a good number of questions and interactions on there now. So please continue to make use of that, and we'll come back to it later in the session today as well. And at that, I'm going to hand over to Fiona, who's joining us tonight, who's going to take us through the first part of tonight's session. Fiona, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Nanette. Welcome everyone who's joining us. I can see there's a couple of people still coming in, so thanks again for coming along to this afternoon session. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. And then we'll get started.
I should remind everybody that the session tonight has been recorded.
Thanks, Nanette. So hopefully you can see the screen okay. And Nanette, can you just confirm that you can see the slides all right for me, please?
It's perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay. So as Nanette said, my name's Fiona Shaw. I'm part of the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities team here at Education Scotland. I've got a sort of science and physics, well, chemistry and physics background before I did this role. And I cover the Forth Valley and West Lothian region. So on the screen here, you can see our email address. So if you do have questions that come up after the session that you maybe haven't thought of during the session, then please do send us an email. Also give us a follow on Twitter. We tend to post sort of resources, updates, and links to kind of professional learning that we run on there as well. A couple of protocols, I think everyone's fairly familiar with these just now, but you know, if you're not speaking, please keep your mics off as I go through. And I will be kind of coming to the chat pane. I'm hoping the session will be quite interactive. So I'll come to the chat pane every few slides or so, just to see what people have popped in. So use that, please, to post any comments or any links or any thoughts that you have as we move through. As well, the nature of the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight can sometimes be, I suppose, quite challenging. So I just wanted to go through these as well before we get started. So we use a lot of binary examples within the session, but we do recognise that gender and sex exist on a spectrum. So girls and women and boys and men are boxes that sit at opposite ends of that spectrum. So as I say, some of the examples we use are binary, but we do that just so that we can identify and talk about the stereotypes. Also, although I mostly talk about gender, there are other characteristics which experience similar stereotyping and unconscious bias. And so we hope that what we talk about can be extended to these. And it's important to remember that where different characteristics intersect, it can also cause additional layers of disadvantage. We also want to approach these topics with support and sensitivity because they can be quite triggering for some people. If there is anything that you would like support with, then please get in touch at the end and I can signpost you to the relevant organisation. And finally, I do want the session to be a non-judgmental space for us to learn and grow together. So as we're sort of moving through, please remember that in your interactions as well. So today's session will give a quick introduction to gender stereotypes and unconscious bias, why tackle this, and then how to mitigate for this in terms of maths. And I just want to give a brief introduction to the IGBE, or Improving Gender Balance and Equalities programme, if you haven't come across this before. So we essentially work with school clusters to explore and assess interventions that address gender imbalances in participation and curricular preferences and learner pathways. And this is at every stage from 3 to 18 years. And the reason for this is because children receive and absorb gender stereotype messages about what they can and can't do as a girl or as a boy from a really early age. But actually, research strongly suggests that there isn't an inherent difference between girls and boys, which should limit those interests or capabilities or ambitions. But when we look at subject choice and many subsequent work and life choices, actually we see that they're quite highly gendered. So the approach we promote is a whole establishment one, trying to tackle the root causes of gender imbalances in a sustained and embedded way. And it's important to note that there are inherent barriers to all young people accessing the same opportunities. So while young people shouldn't be coerced into making any particular decisions, adopting the attitude that young people are able to choose whatever they want for themselves doesn't necessarily counteract the problem. So to get started, I would like, if you've got a smartphone, please scan that QR code. If you prefer to do it on your laptop, I'm just going to pop a link into the chat pane. And what I'd like you to do is just to enter 3 words that you associate with girls and 3 words you associate with boys. You do them as separate entries as the Menti prompts you to do. So it can be stereotypical as you like. I'm not trying to catch you out. The best thing to do is just enter it without thinking and just try and get the first thing that comes into your head for this. So it can be to do with likes and dislikes, expectations, etc. So I'll give you a minute or so just to do that. So hopefully you can see that as well. So if you've used Menti before, you'll know that the bigger the words, the more often it's been put in. So while you're looking at this, if I could get you to have a think about any patterns or anything that's kind of jumping out at you, and just share your reflections in the chat pane, please. And in a minute or so, I'll move it on to the boys one and get you to do the same for that one as well. So how could you classify, I suppose, the kind of words that are coming through here? Great, thank you. So we've got kind of soft words. Yep, so you've got things like gentle, soft flowers. Mainly about visual features as well. Yep, so we've got makeup, pretty, dress, glitter. Great, I'm going to share the boys one just now as well and see what the differences are. And again, please feel free to just share your reflections in the chat pane. Great, so we've got expected to be louder and tougher. Definitely, yeah, like strong is the biggest word in this one, which is really interesting, and that kind of crops up in one way or another, and definitely more active as well. Football comes through, blue, and we'll just look back at the girls one again. So we've got pink, pretty, gentle, caring, yeah. So what we can see here is the words associated with girls tend to be either associated with appearance, as we've identified, associated with sort of nurturing characteristics or caring characteristics, whereas the boys tend to be more to do with kind of physicality, more to do with being active. People often highlight as well there's more negative words in the boys one, and it's really interesting to see the sort of distinctions between the two. Now, I said feel free to be as stereotypical as you like. and I wasn't trying to catch you out. And so the point of this activity really is for us to highlight the stereotypes. Now, we don't necessarily subscribe to those stereotypes, but they do exist, and it can be quite hard to stop them from having an effect on us, which we will explore a little bit more in the session today. So thank you very much for contributing to the Menti. That's an activity as well that can be quite interesting to do with young people, just to sort of get their opinion and their thoughts on where they're at with that thinking as well. So despite us being able to identify stereotypes and quite big differences between girls and boys, research actually says otherwise. So this is Visible Learning by John Hattie, and the first sentence essentially says that while there are some biological differences between boys and girls, there are a few differences cognitively or psychologically between them. And actually, in terms of interest, ability, attainment, behaviour, and many other things, there's a bigger difference between boys and between girls than there is between boys and girls separately, if that makes sense. So bigger difference between children of the same gender than between them. And therefore, it shouldn't have really an impact on future choices and opportunities. And just to help make that sort of differentiation a little bit more, I know I spoke about the binary nature that we use to highlight stereotypes, but I also find this visual quite useful to kind of differentiate between gender, sex and sexual orientation, especially if we're having conversations with young people about this. So at the top, we've kind of got gender identity and expression, and that's really what we're talking about today. So might identify as a woman, but express in a masculine way, or as a man and express in a feminine way, or as a man and express in a masculine way. So there's different ways that you can combine those. Then you've got sex assigned at birth, which is a biological sex, and then the physical and emotionally attracted to is more to do with sexual orientation. And as we said, gender and sex exist on a spectrum. So girls and women and boys and men are boxes at opposite ends. And what stereotypes do is help reinforce those limiting boxes, making it harder for girls to express what's perceived as typically masculine behaviours, and even harder for boys to express what's perceived as typically feminine behaviours. So by deconstructing those limiting boxes, we actually hopefully free up everyone to be who they are and choose what they want to do without kind of limitation or fear of reprisal. If you are working with young people who are transgender as well, there's some recent guidance by the Scottish Government that came out. I'm just posting that in the chat pane. It's very long, but it's very comprehensive. So if that was something that you were sort of experiencing at the minute, then please do refer to that guidance. And just to define a gender stereotype, it's essentially a widely held belief or generalisation about the behaviours, about the characteristics and roles performed by women and men. And they are attributes based on gender. So for the purpose of our work, as I said, we are quite often binary, but we know that's not how gender is. And gender stereotypes, we explored them a little bit during the word clouds and in the definition I just gave. But actually, gender stereotypes and unconscious bias are linked. So gender stereotypes feeds into unconscious bias and vice versa. So I just want to explore the concept of unconscious bias a little bit more. And I'm going to ask you to do a little activity. If you feel comfortable where you are, I'm going to get you to close your eyes and picture something. And I want you to just try and hold on to the first picture that pops into your head. So the first thing I'd like you to imagine is a nurse. And if you could just pop in the chat pane whether the person you imagine was a woman or a man. And again, not trying to catch you out. It's just to highlight. Okay, so thank you. Thanks for sharing. We've got quite a few coming through. So the majority are seeing a woman, then there's a couple more that are imagining a man. Okay, and I'm going to move on to the next one. And can I get you please to imagine a firefighter? And again, just pop that into the chat pane for me, what it was that you pictured. Okay, so a lot of people picturing a man for this one. Okay, and a scientist. A bit more of a mixture for this one. Okay, so thanks to those of you who are willing to share that with me. I think what that demonstrates is the power and influence of our unconscious bias, you know, the sort of society we've been raised in. If you pictured, I suppose, a non-stereotypical person in a role, then it's probably because you knew someone or you've met someone who you can picture. So I've got a friend who is a woman who is a firefighter, for example. So that's the person that I would picture. You might have also tried deliberately to imagine a non-stereotypical image because of the setting we're in, because we're in this training. And this is a great example of how we're able to mitigate our unconscious bias in the moment. And you tend to be able to do this because you're hopefully in a calm and reflective setting where you're primed to be thinking about stereotypes and equality. But most of us, as we saw, me included, will likely have a fairly stereotypical image in our heads. So a nurse being a young woman, a firefighter being a big, strong, muscly man, possibly with tattoos, and the scientist, possibly that kind of Einstein stereotype. Also in my head, everyone I imagined was white. None of them had a disability. I didn't necessarily go into detail thinking about the sexuality, but had I probably would have made assumptions about that too. And that's because of something called unconscious bias. And our unconscious bias processes a lot more information than our conscious mind. It does it really quickly. It uses lots of different information, so verbal and non-verbal, and it uses those kind of built up images and experiences that we've seen throughout our lives. It refers to something that we're unaware of, or something that happens outside of our control. And assumptions about people tend to be based on quite simple characterization of them. So things like their age, race, or gender. And the whole point is it happens unconsciously. And it can quite often be in direct opposition to the beliefs that we actually hold. And therefore, it can be quite challenging to identify it and quite hard to admit it as well. So I know sort of actively try to be anti-racist, but I do have, because of the world that I was brought up in, I do have unconscious bias around race. And that can be quite hard to admit because I don't actively want that to happen, but it has happened, if that makes sense. So it can lead to different things. It can lead to different treatment of people. So one example of that is affinity bias. That's where we treat someone more favourably because they're more similar to us. So when I'm delivering sessions like this and I see someone come online who's sort of reminds me of me a little bit, I become warmer and I relax a little bit. So that's an example of that situation. And I noticed doing that in all areas of life. So it can be helpful. So it helps sports players make quick decisions and it helps people drive their cars and react quickly. But often it can be very wrong. And if it's unchecked, it can lead to prejudice. Unconscious bias, on the other hand, is a reflection of a person's feelings and values, and it involves active discrimination, exclusion or harm to another person or group of people. It can also present as tokenism. So if somebody has a relationship with an individual pupil, behaves in one way, but when outside of their job role in society as a whole might have different views, but doesn't necessarily agree with that. So the concept of unconscious bias is definitely more palatable because it happens out with our control and it doesn't necessarily align with our values, but reflection on that should also lead to us reflecting unconscious bias. And it can be quite challenging because it can, as I said, involve exploring our value and belief systems and how they were formed and whether these have been influenced by prejudice and unequal structures that excuse harmful behaviours and attitudes. So in education, a learner or a practitioner's unconscious and conscious bias around gender is likely to have an impact on a learner's well-being, on their confidence, on their participation, attainment and achievements, as it might lead them to use experiences or things seen in the media or assumptions around gender to create those kind of generic expectations for girls and boys. So that can be quite harmful because then girls and boys might be subtly influenced into thinking that they should do certain things or that they shouldn't do other things or that they're good at some things or bad at other things. And I suppose the most direct link for that would be around sort of subject choice and the influence it might have then. So I provided a bit of an introduction around stereotypes and unconscious bias. And I just want to sort of put this back to yourselves and ask the question why. And now this is usually a really important starting point for wanting to make the change and wanting to address unconscious bias and gender stereotypes. Because if you don't have the why, then it's quite easy to lose momentum, and it also helps to bring other people on board. So I'm going to ask you just to reflect on this. Why do you think it's important to challenge gender stereotypes and unconscious bias? Now, if you're comfortable with this, if I can get you to type it into the chat pane, but don't press return yet. And then what we'll do is we'll all press return at the same time. So we get a kind of like a waterfall effect of comments. So you might want to consider your own experiences, your own day-to-day lives. For example, one of my strong reasons around this is for sort of women, young women, all women, to feel safe walking home in the dark at night. So that, you know, that link for me is quite strong. So it's quite a personal reason, but there might be a professional reason as well. So I'll give you a minute just to think about that. And as I said, if you're happy, please pop that, type it into the chat pane. And when I say, we can all press return and share that. Okay, if you have popped something into the chat pane, can I get you to press return just now? And we'll just see what everyone's popped in. Fantastic, so we've got quite a few coming through here. So breaking through glass ceilings and not be limited in their learning or career, yeah, definitely. Equality, acceptance, security and comfort, really important ones, which we'll talk about in a minute, to do with well-being as well. Stop people feeling like outsiders, yeah. Remove limitations, remove barriers to reach potential, silence is complicity. Definitely, really like that one as well. To treat everyone fairly without prejudice. Yep, men to be open about feelings, definitely. And the links again to sort of mental health. Experience the same things. Wanting to see everyone's opinions as valid. Limits opportunities. Yeah, great. So some really nice messages coming through. And as I say here, just taking this time to reflect on that can quite often be the starting point, whether it be professional or personal. But hopefully, you know, when it is personal, it also comes into the professional element. And it is part of the GTCS standards, as I'm sure you'll be familiar with as well. It's kind of built into the refresh standards quite explicitly about challenging stereotypes and unconscious bias. So thank you very much to those of you who shared that. I'm just going to share a couple of other ways as well. So we mentioned in the chat pane there's quite a few things, connections to sort of health and well-being. And the research, some of the research shows that primary age boys were actually 3 times more likely to experience high social, emotional, behavioural and or mental health needs compared to girls. But actually, as children get older, that kind of flips a little bit, and girls end up having sort of worse general well-being by the time they reach teenage years. And then again, when you think about the sort of stats around anxiety and mental health, and those research also shows that where children have friendship groups that really emphasize those traditional stereotypes, they tend to have lower well-being as well. I suppose for some of the reasons you suggested, you know, not feeling like they could be themselves. So to make the links, you know, from a young age, boys potentially told don't cry, and to suppress that emotion is perceived as feminine, and instead tend to express themselves via anger. Potentially from a young age, boys are played with more roughly or in a more physical way and expected to be a bit more active. And again, this links to the, I suppose, the teenage girls' mental health decline, to do with the fact that they're potentially less physically active, and again that impacts on mental health and well-being. And lastly, girls tend to be raised to be compliant and quiet and take up less space, and so this compliance can then mean that they put extra pressure on themselves when it comes to schoolwork and other achievements leading to poorer mental health, as we've said, in teenage years. And I wanted to make the links as well because obviously the UNCRC is about to be incorporated into Scots law. So it's important that we're making those connections to the different articles. And I've picked two out here, but there's definitely connections to lots of others as well. But around that freedom of expression, that kind of emotional literacy, and children of certain genders being expected to express themselves in certain ways. And then also Article 19 and 39, linked to domestic abuse and the fact that that is a gendered issue. And 1 in 5 children in the UK will have experienced domestic abuse by the time they reach 18, potentially even higher now as well. So these are just two connections, I suppose, linked to health and wellbeing, and some of the reasons why we should address gender stereotypes. As well, we've got links to attainment. I'm having lots of conversations with teachers around attainment gaps between girls and boys. Nationally, girls actually outperform boys in numeracy at all levels, but this might not be the case in your setting because that's national. So a number of primary schools, it was found that boys were outperforming girls, and this started as early as P3 and got wider as they got older. So I suppose it's important to think about that in the context of your own school. And what's interesting is that in schools where gender constructions are less accentuated, boys tend to attain better. So another thing worth considering. And again, making those links to sort of gender stereotyping in early childhood, girls tend to be read to more and spoken to in more complex sentences, which might be an indicator for boys' lower attainment and literacy, for example. However, boys generally attain lower than girls for a number of indicators, but there is evidence to show as well that their abilities are often overestimated by the adults in their lives. And actually, over time, this causes boys to blame external factors when things go wrong. And potentially linked to that is teachers' expectations of boys' attainment and behaviour, and how that can actually influence actual attainment. And again, just making the links to the UNCRC. So Article 29 is around education developing every child's personality and talents to the full. But if there's gender gaps in attainment and gaps in attainment for those with other protected characteristics, then they're not developing their full potential. So again, it's important that we address it for those reasons. And then participation. So the differences in who joins which club, who joins which activity when given the free choice. And in the No More Boys and Girls documentary, which looks at younger children, we see children guided towards different toys based on their assumption of gender. So this could mean different skills get developed. Boys develop more spatial awareness skills, which again has a link to sort of numeracy and maths. And girls tend to get pushed towards the kind of dolls and soft toys, developing those caring and nurturing skills, which could then influence what they enjoy, what they feel they're good at, and therefore the choices they make, eventually leading to women and girls opting for courses or jobs in areas like care work, which tend to be lower paid or undervalued jobs. And again, the links here around the right to play. So if they can't participate fully in a variety of activities, then they're not developing that. And again, it links into Article 29 around the goals of education and the freedom of association. So barriers relating to gender might prevent children from joining clubs or from meeting. And gender policing from children themselves can actually prevent access to activities. You know, you might hear younger children say, "You're not allowed in here, you're a girl," or "Boys can't come in here," and that kind of thing. It might present itself slightly differently with older children, but something worth listening out for. And we can see that participation in STEM hires really hasn't changed. So this is data since the 80s, and it shows the percentage of entries that are male. So at the bottom, we've got biology and human biology, which is around 30% male, therefore 70% females. And then we've got physics and computing science, which has remained fairly similar since the 80s, which is dominated by boys. In the middle, we've got chemistry and maths, which seem to be about 50-50. But actually, when you look at the reasons behind that, they quite often tend to be different, and they quite often tend to be gendered as well. So kind of just wanted to put another question to you. What differences do you notice in children of different genders? So I've kind of given a bit of an overview in terms of health and well-being, in terms of participation and attainment. Is there any of those that are kind of speaking to you that you notice with the children in your class? It would just be interesting to sort of hear any thoughts on that or any reflections on that. Please feel free to share them in the chat pane. Okay, so we've got a couple of things come in here about maturity, girls tending to mature faster than boys, which is also an interesting one. I suppose it's worth reflecting on how much of that is our expectation around that as well. I'm not talking about like day-to-day expectations, I'm talking about sort of like years of built up that expectation that boys aren't ready for school and girls are more mature. So that's a really interesting one to think about. Girls more able to be creative, boys often embarrassed about that. Yeah, and I think, you know, thinking about the kind of toys that children might be pushed towards, again, thinking about where that starts. So that's quite an interesting thing to think about. Girls persevere more and ask for help to keep trying. Boys tend to not want to show that they're struggling. Yeah, so again, linking to that kind of keeping it inside mentality, definitely. And girls seem to worry more. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks so much for sort of sharing those reflections. I think it's useful to just to pause and take stock on this and try and relate it to your own practice. I'm going to pop a graph up just now, which looks mad, but I'm going to explain it. So essentially, what research shows is that girls tend to have less confidence when it comes to numeracy and maths. And this was an OECD study, and it basically asked children to rate themselves in terms of the following statements that you can see in the graph. So it shows the average percentage of students who reported they could solve those problems in different contexts. The blue bar shows the percentage of boys who reported they could do something, and the diamond shapes represent the girls. And where the diamond's black, it means the differences between boys and girls are statistically significant. So as you can see, as soon as the questions are put into an unfamiliar context, so the actual distance on a map or the petrol consumption rate of a car, and then the girls, both boys and girls, become less sure they can answer them, but the effect is much greater for the girls. So we could draw from this that the more unfamiliar the context, the less confident the girls are on average. So slightly fewer of the girls reported they could understand graphs in newspapers or use that train timetable. But that reduction was even greater with the petrol consumption. So it can suggest that girls have a lack of confidence in applying knowledge, but also important to consider the context that are being used in the questions here as well. And as I've mentioned already, you know, thinking about the toys, girls potentially not have the confidence to kind of explore that in a low risk environment, means that they might give up easily or not attempt the question. And again, more recent PISA research also suggests that more girls than boys in Scotland say that when they're failing, it makes them doubt plans for the future. So something worth considering is about the kind of confidence differences and how that can be overcome. And I've put perceptions of STEM here because I'm kind of keeping it fairly generic, but when you imagined your scientist earlier, there was a good mixture. But actually, some young people, there was a longitudinal study, it's the Aspires 2 report, was done, and essentially perceived STEM subjects to be for the only very clever people. But then there's also a problem in who perceives themselves and is perceived by others to be clever. So the Aspires 2 report essentially confirms that identifying with cleverness isn't simply derived from academic attainment, but it's also racialized, class and gendered. So essentially cleverness is aligned with being middle class, being white and being masculine. So for those girls or working class and minority ethnic students, it's hard to be recognised as clever or, self-identify as clever and therefore seen in this light. And that's regardless of attainment, particularly amplified in the case of physics. So I suppose language is important here in terms of maths and numeracy, in the setting or in the school that you're in. Is it perceived or is it put across as a hard subject or a tricky subject? And then that, I suppose, serves to reinforce that idea that you need to be clever. So thinking about the image of the subject as well is really important. So that kind of complex mixture of self-identity and confidence, combined with the gender stereotypes we explored, as well as the skills developed, can actually mean that some choices feel off limits to young people. And it is quite complex, and I suppose we're not going to fix it overnight, but I did want to just share a couple of things with you that might help with that. So this is quite numeracy specific. I think to this point I've been a bit more generic in terms of the impact of gender stereotypes. But what we can see on the left-hand side here is it's important to consider interactions and language. And again, this is all research informed. I'm not saying that it would be every pupil and every teacher in every class, but enough to draw these conclusions. So what's interesting is that female teachers might interact more with boys during maths and numeracy activities, to kind of compensate for that perceived lack of readiness for school. And that actually could lead to more teacher time and support. So that could start in primary school and follow through. Also, language used, as I said before, can impact the perception of maths. Things like, when I was younger, I was rubbish at fractions, or I know it seems hard, but you'll get there, and that kind of thing. So that can be quite powerful. I remember it was an S3 or S4 girl who was sort of choosing options, and she said she was remembering in S1, one teacher had said to her, "Oh, I never managed to get my maths higher, so I'll be really proud if you can get it." And that put her off picking it because she felt like it would be too hard for her. So these kind of comments and language really sit with young people, and in particular girls can have an impact on their confidence. Contexts and activities. So we saw in the graph about the different contexts that the more unfamiliar it is, the less confident girls are. So thinking about that, thinking about a diverse range of mathematicians being used and linking it to future jobs and skills as well that led to those transferable skills. And then that kind of maths anxiety. Again, research tells us that maths anxiety is more likely to affect girls, and also maths anxiety of others, so parents and teachers, again often female, is more likely to impact maths anxiety in girls. So if a girl sees a female teacher who lacks in confidence, it will negatively impact on them and their attitudes and attainment. And what's interesting is that the researchers propose the same doesn't happen to boys. So they don't see the same amount of male teachers in those kind of early stages. And those kind of differences in maths anxiety emerge early in primary school and then can continue into secondary settings. And then there's something else, again, in terms of groupings or setting. If the proportion of girls and boys in the grouping isn't balanced, then it can impact girls' sense of belonging in maths, for example, if there's more boys in top sets. And that can be quite complex, and again, unconscious bias can come into play in terms of grouping. That kind of stereotype threat or unconscious bias that boys are naturally better at maths. And again, it's not something that we'd ever want to admit outwardly, but our unconscious bias might be at play in those situations. So what can you do? Well, as I've said previously, the unconscious bias can impact expectations. Less focus on getting the right answers, providing that kind of social support, and emphasizing that growth mindset. So making the mistakes to learn can be really helpful. So when there's less focus on getting the right answers, students tend to show less maths anxiety. I I think constant reflection on your own language and your own unconscious bias, addressing that kind of gender policing between learners, that sort of those microaggressions or the sexist comments that might come across. Using language like equally as good at rather than just as good at, if talking in that way. And also making interactions as part of lesson observations can be quite helpful, just to see where your time is going. So if you're in a position where someone's observing you, just get them to keep a tally of how many interactions you're having with boys, girls, etc. Involving learners, asking children about their attitudes and enjoyment of maths, so encouraging them to sort of reflective journal moments where they struggled and what their process was to overcome that. And we spoke before about the kind of diversity, but increasing the visibility of positive female role models within maths, but also around the school as well. And then I suppose lastly, but also really importantly, involving parents and carers to kind of dispel those stereotypes and maths anxiety. I wanted to, before I share some of our resources to help with this, I wanted to just finish with this quote. This is from somebody who focused their dissertation on gender gaps in maths attainment in primary schools. So I'll just give you a minute to read through that. Okay, so hopefully you managed to read through that. I just think it's a really nice quote, and I suppose highlights some of the issues that I've spoken about in today's session. So just to finish, I wanted to share a couple of resources in case you were interested in learning a bit more. We've got a number of podcasts that explore this topic in different areas. I'm just going to post the links into the chat pane for you. The introduction goes into a little bit more detail on what we've spoken about, and gender inequality in society takes it a bit wider, and then the others, as you can see, are there as well. We also have professional learning events coming up. There's actually one on Thursday. It's me again, so if you're not sick of hearing my voice, then and you're free on Thursday and have the energy, then feel free to sign up, or just post the link to that in the chat pane as well. We do run those sessions on a monthly basis, so if you can't make that one, please feel free to come along to another one in the new year. And we've also got a number of guides that might be helpful. So we've got a kind of a quick start guide, an action guide for secondary as well, and I'm going to pop those into the chat pane, and they just give you, I suppose, a summary of the positive actions that you can take that I went over there as well. And lastly, we have got a Teams network, and I know everyone's got 1,000 Teams networks that they're part of at the minute, but if you wanted to join this one, essentially we share resources that are coming out, and we also provide a monthly drop-in session if anyone wants to chat about this. So I'll pop the code as well into the chat pane. It's a 0, not an O. So feel free to join that. I would encourage you to join that as well. Once you've joined, you know you're kind of there, and you can drop in and see any of the reminders that we put out as well. So I think that's everything from me. Thank you very much for your participation. It's been a whistle-stop tour, and I realise I've given you a lot of information, but hopefully that's been kind of useful and thought-provoking. If this is the first time that you've heard some of this, it can be quite difficult, I suppose, to process. So, as I say, please get in touch if you've got questions, and I will let you carry on with your session. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Fiona. That was great. Thank you. Can I ask, will you share the links with us, and we'll add it on to a section on the Padlet so that people can access it after today?